Hello, scientists. It's Mr. Gopal here with a lesson on the environment and human impact. This is specifically on biodiversity, and we want to talk about the trade-offs that we need to consider when we balance resource use against conservation of biodiversity. You might ask yourself, in certain situations, what is the trade-off? And so I'm trying to get you to think about the idea that no matter what choice we make, even if it's a positive overall choice for human beings, it might come at the cost of the environment. Simple example, if I build a farm in a certain place, I'm able to feed human beings. So let's say I start farming corn here in New York. Let's say not in New York City, but out in upstate New York, where there's a lot more kind of natural land at my disposal. You might ask yourself, what's the harm in that? You're growing food. We know that growing plants in general is good for the atmosphere. However, I might have destroyed the natural habitat of certain plants and animals in order to build that farm. And so I've irreversibly destroyed a certain habitat or ecosystem, and that comes with consequences for the biodiversity of that area. So there are so many resources in this particular lesson, so it's important for me to go quickly through some of the graphs and then talk about the resource that I've made for you. So if we look at some of the graphs in this, we can see that there is an undeniable connection between the rise in human population and the amount of extinctions over the last roughly 200 years. So going back to 1800 up to the present day, we have a dramatic rise, almost an exponential rise in human population over time. And as that has happened, the amount of extinctions of other species has grown considerably as well. We see that charted on the left-hand side of the vertical or y-axis, while human population is charted on the right-hand side. Now you might say to yourself, well, there are so many different factors that contribute to the demise of a certain species. How can we be certain that it's human beings that have specifically contributed to the extinction of so many different species? That's a big accusation. Well, if we look here, according to scientists, and this is taken from a Washington Post article, but it's based on the global assessment of a scientific group, that we can see that various percentages of fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, and amphibians have become extinct. These are all vertebrate species, and they've all become extinct over now the last over 500 years, according to human activity. And you see a huge spike starting again over the last 200 years. So, and that roughly coincides with the Industrial Revolution. So the increased burning of fossil fuels, creating pollution in the air, the allocation of land towards man-made efforts to either power urban centers or suburban centers, and also grow more food for the growing population. And when I talk about growing food, I'm not only talking about farming plants, but I'm talking about farming animals in a sense. So poultry, beef, etc. Not only are we allocating land away from the habitats of certain plants and animals, but when we do this, we are also contributing to climate change, because the processing of poultry and beef and other meats, it burns a lot of fossil fuels, thereby releasing a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and contributing to the rise in temperature, or the climate change, the negative climate change of the globe. Okay, so that's my little bit of background. Now, there are multiple videos on human impacts and biodiversity, all leading to an independent work sample where you have to read a chapter on environmental biology and understand how various efforts could be made to preserve biodiversity and why this is a good thing. And here's my resource for you. So actually I need to remove that. Again, when I talk about climate change, and I've said this in multiple other videos, when we say weather, we're talking about daily patterns in the state of the atmosphere. So is it raining today? Is it sunny? Is it foggy? Is it going to snow, etc.? And we can't glean a lot about climate change from that. Climate is about weather patterns spanning years and decades and centuries, even millennia. When climate scientists track climate change, they're even looking at patterns over millions of years, okay? And so it's undeniable that over those millions of years, there was a reliable climate cycle. There's a reliable warming and cooling of the planet that we could track that seemed to be normal and healthy. However, when human beings came along, that cycle became disrupted, in particular in the last 200 years. And that 200 years has also coincided with a stunning reduction in biodiversity. So when I say biodiversity, I'm talking about a rough measure of the amount of different species of plants and animals across the globe. And I named some reasons why biodiversity is positive for the earth. And this might be the most important part of this resource. This is something that you want to keep front and center as you analyze different policy proposals for addressing climate change. Okay, biodiversity is a very important component when it comes to activists fighting climate change and talking about policies that will kind of reduce the impact or reduce the speed of climate change. So for one, natural habitats with diverse species will encourage competition. The basic idea here is that every species has a role to play. And some of these roles, as I say in number 3, we can't predict. Evolution can work in mysterious ways. It's very important that we allow it to occur uninterrupted, because that will result in the greatest amount of natural selection. All right, I'm going to jump to the last part of this table, which is ocean acidification, because this is a really good example of how climate change reduces biodiversity and ultimately harms us, not only the species who become extinct because of our actions, but it will harm human beings' progress as well. So the basic idea with ocean acidification is that as more and more CO2 is trapped in the atmosphere, more and more of it is absorbed by the ocean. Because of the way that that CO2 interacts with the water in the ocean, the salt water, we create hydrogen ions, which increases the pH level of the ocean, right? And so that new kind of chemical balance in the ocean is harmful to a lot of species in the ocean. Specifically, coral and shell structures can't survive in acidic oceans, and as they die out, the ocean is less diverse. You might ask yourself again, why does it matter if that many species of coral survive? Well, microscopic bacteria feed off of the algae that plants on coral. Okay, in turn, they are consumed by very small amphibious life, small fish, which are consumed in turn by larger fish. So if we remove one link in this chain of, I guess, predator and prey, you could say, then the entire ocean ecosystem is irreversibly kind of disrupted. And you will see the quick dwindling of more predatory species as well as those prey that die off quickly. So that's one problem. That's one specific example of how you can't even affect these microscopic forms or these coral forms in the ocean without severely impacting overall life in the ocean and ultimately our own progress. Other things that are discussed in these videos are renewables or forms of energy that we can continually use without having to permanently diminish our resources. The example that I use of renewable energy is solar energy. So solar energy is renewable because the resource is the sun. The sun has been burning for many millions of years and will continue to. We can continue to convert its light energy into electricity and heat for ourselves. So that is a form of renewable energy, capturing light energy and converting it into electricity. Land use is the final thing that I want to talk about that's addressed in multiple times in these videos. So when we say land use, we're talking about human use of land. It can be used for farming. It can be used to build communities. It can be used to build power centers. The more we use, the less we allot to nature. This goes back to one of the first points I made in this video, that overuse of our land will disrupt habitats and cycles of nature. All of this is negative for biodiversity. And so as you look at the article, here's the final part of my resource. When we talk about preserving biodiversity and you want to annotate this article, which is complex, I give you a 3-step process here. The first thing that you want to do is you want to identify the value of biodiversity in a given scenario. So I did that earlier with ocean acidification, but in every scenario, it's a little bit different. So you want to talk about specific species that are initially impacted and then subsequent effects on other species. And that will be the best way to identify the value. And you'll see it at the end of every kind of chain of effects, you will see an effect on human progress. Now, the next thing you want to do is you want to track human behavior, how human impact is leading to that reduction. So what are we specifically doing that is causing the initial disruption of the natural order of things in a given ecosystem? So again, I'm going to jump back to my ocean acidification example because it's a pretty good illustration. Okay, our initial action is to burn more fossil fuels and increase CO2 in the air. The domino effect is that the ocean gets acidified, and then after that, we start losing some of the diversity in our oceans, but at a rapid rate. The final thing after you've addressed both of those things and you've annotated them is you want to see the solution. And you specifically want to understand how a change in behavior of human beings or human communities is linked to the improvement in biodiversity in a certain habitat. Now, if you do those 3 things, you'll be able to fill out the table for this independent work very well. Okay, so we're looking for changing of human behaviors, how that's an initiative, what are examples of that, as well as conservation in preserves, that is nature preserves, areas where humans are not allowed to build or disrupt. We want to talk about habitat restoration, which is the actual giving back of certain habitats to nature. So the removal of human involvement from certain habitats. And then finally, you want to talk about the role of zoos in captive breeding. The simplest example I can offer of captive breeding is the breeding of livestock for food. So chickens, cows, and so on and so forth, how captive breeding of them changes that species inalterably and also disrupts the environment. So we've covered a lot today. Not only is this an opportunity to understand a very important phenomenon going on across the world that is definitely impacting your life, but it's a good opportunity to improve your ability to annotate for certain ideas and assimilate your thoughts in language. So I hope this has been helpful. Stick with it. This stuff is complicated and the impacts are so far reaching and wide. It can be a lot to get your head around. It can also be a lot to not feel overwhelmed about. But trust me, the more that you invest in this, the more that you invest in being part of the solution. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I will see you soon.